So logic, roughly speaking, gives us rules for reasoning about any given subject matter. It tells us how we ought to reason, rather than making substantive claims about the world or about the nature of reality. And some people have thought that Christianity makes claims which are logically incoherent. So, for instance, the divinity of Christ, right? Christ is supposed to be both divine and human, but you might think that being divine entails being non-human, so you have some sort of incompatibility here. Now, there's two ways you can go with that sort of claim. Some people, there's some logicians recently have suggested that Christian theology should maybe give up on classical logic. So in classical logic, you can't have any true contradictions. It can't be the case for any proposition P, it can't be the case at P and not P. But there are other forms of logic which allow true contradictions, paraconsistent logics. And so some people suggested Christian theologians should accept the contradiction, but say that's fine, and just adopt a logic where you can have contradictions. The problem in classical logic is if you have a contradiction, it entails absolutely everything. It follows that every single proposition is true. So you need a logic that's weaker than classical logic in the sense of having rules that you can prove less from. But a more standard approach is just to try and parse these claims in a way that doesn't involve contradictions. So at the Council of Chalcedon, it was asserted that Christ has two natures, one is divine, one is human. And so there's no single nature which is both divine and human, and so both divine and not divine. So the usual route that theologians take is not to accept contradictions, but try to understand those doctrines in terms which don't involve any contradiction. I mean, do you want me to... there are other ways that logic is connected up with philosophy of religion. So fairly recently, thinking in the 1950s, there was development, 1950s, 60s, 70s, there were developments in modal logic. Modal logic is the logic you use to reason about things like possibility and necessity. Now, modal logic revived the ontological argument, which is an argument which is supposed to show that God exists just by understanding the concept of God. So in modal logic, there are a number of different modal logics. The one used to reason about absolute possibility and absolute necessity is called S5. Now in S5, if something is possibly necessary, then it is necessary, then it's actually necessary. And this suggests a new kind of ontological argument for the existence of God, because God, classically understood, is a necessary being. Right? Classically understood, God is the sort of being that if God exists, God couldn't possibly fail to exist. God can't die or be exterminated or go out of existence. Now, how does that create an ontological argument? Well, if you think it's possible, at least possible, that kind of being exists, then it follows that kind of being necessarily does exist. Because according to S5, the modal logic to reason about absolute possibility and necessity, if something is possibly necessary, then it is actually necessary. And so if it's possible that a necessary being exists, that necessary being must exist. And that's kind of counterintuitive, but you can think about it in terms of, imagine possibilities in terms of possible worlds. So each possible world is just a description of a different kind of maximal possibility. You can think of it this way: if something's necessary, it's true in every possible world. And if something's possible, then there's at least one possible world where it's true. Now, these possible worlds, we don't have to imagine them existing or anything like that. It's just, we can safely consider it a heuristic device, right, for our purposes. Now, what that says is a necessary being is a being that exists in every possible world. So take any possible world. If the being exists at that possible world, it must exist at every other possible world as well. So if that being's possible, then it must exist in at least one possible world. So here it is in one possible world, this possible world over here. But if it exists in that possible world, because it's necessary in that possible world, what does that mean? Well, it means it exists in every single possible world. So modal logic gives us this new kind of ontological argument. If you start with the premise that it's at least possible that God exists and that God is a necessary being, then you get the conclusion just from those premises that God, in fact, does exist and exists necessarily. But there's a kind of twist to this, because you can run the argument in the other direction as well, from the premise that possibly God doesn't exist. So if you start with the premise it's possible that God doesn't exist, then the same modal logic, S5, gives you the conclusion that God necessarily doesn't exist. So whether this favors the theist or the atheist is still kind of up for debate. It really hinges on our modal knowledge, right? On whether we can rationally support the idea that possibly God exists or that possibly God doesn't exist. What it shows you is that the theist only has to establish the possible existence of God to establish the existence of God. And the atheist only has to establish the possible non-existence of God to establish the actual non-existence of God. So it kind of ramps up the stakes in both directions.